From Joe having issues with Fallon Fox competing in women's sports, to him mentioning how the whole gender equality thing is getting out of hand. Here are Joe Rogan's controversial views on female UFC fighters. Let's kick this off with how Joe thinks Fallon Fox is not a woman. Fallon used to participate in MMA matches against women who were born as women, but she herself is a transgender woman. Guess who decided to weigh in as always? Joe Rogan, of course. The podcaster had strong feelings about this, as he thought Fallon shouldn't have been allowed to compete against cisgender women. Why, you ask? Well, according to Joe, Fallon had an unfair physical advantage over her opponents. He was worried that this advantage could lead to some serious injuries, or even life-threatening damage for her opponents in the ring. If Joe were to explain his stance to you, he'd say, imagine being in a fight where your opponent is just bigger and stronger than you. It's like trying to win a race when the other person has a head start, or playing a game where someone has an extra set of arms. It just doesn't seem fair, right? That's exactly what Joe Rogan was getting at. He felt that allowing Fallon to fight against cisgender women could potentially put them in danger, and he wanted to make sure that everyone had a fair chance in the ring and that nobody's safety was compromised. It's important to note that not everyone agrees with Joe Rogan's viewpoint. Some people believe that transgender athletes should be allowed to compete in the gender category they identify with, while others share Joe's concerns about physical advantages. It's definitely a complex topic, and people have different opinions on how to approach it. But one thing's for sure, Joe Rogan is never shy about speaking his mind, and this was no exception. Wait until you hear the rest of what he had to say. He received a lot of backlash over the rest of his comments. Back in 2013, during an episode of his podcast, Joe shared his thoughts about a transgender MMA athlete. He went on to say that he didn't agree with her being allowed to compete against women in the sport. Joe argued that since the athlete had previously been identified as a man, he believed that she possessed physical advantages that could impact the fairness of the fights. He then mentioned things like bone structure, hand size, and shoulder joints, claiming that these characteristics are typically associated with being male and could give her an edge over her opponents. Naturally, he faced a lot of criticism for his remarks, with many people accusing him of being transphobic. They felt that his comments were disrespectful and failed to acknowledge the experiences and identities of transgender individuals. Things got so bad that Fallon went ahead and asked Spotify to remove his transphobic content. She took to Facebook to express her criticism towards Rogan, and called on Spotify to cancel the Joe Rogan Experience podcast after his transphobic remarks. Fox said that once again, Joe was being transphobic, and he's got a long history of making transphobic comments. Fallon added that it's becoming too frequent to ignore, and that it's about time Spotify took action and canceled his show. Fox's statement highlighted not just hers, but others' concerns about Rogan's repeated transphobic episodes too, and urged the streaming platform to dish out some punishment to the podcast. Do you know what the worst part of all this chaos is? That wasn't the last time he said all those things. In fact, just recently, he went off again on transgender people and their inclusion in female sports. Once again, he brought this topic up during a conversation on his podcast with physician Peter Attia. The discussion revolved around the physical size of professional athletes, and Joe pointed out that there is a natural inequality when it comes to physical attributes. He used the example of weight classes in sports to highlight this point. From there, he transitioned into expressing his surprise and disbelief about the inclusion of transgender athletes in certain sports. Joe said that there's a reason why we have weight classes. According to him, it's why we should have the difference between females and males competing against each other. He also added that this is the reason why the whole trans thing makes him mad. Once again, all of Rogan's comments sparked controversy and brought differing opinions. While some agreed with his viewpoint, many others argued for inclusivity and equal opportunities for transgender athletes. In this same instance, he even brought up another athlete. He gave the example of Leah Thomas, who recently won the women's 500 free at the NCAA Swimming Championships while representing the University of Pennsylvania. Joe expressed his thoughts on the situation, saying that in swimming, Leah Thomas is still considered the top swimmer in the world, and biologically.
Swimmer Leah Thomas taking first place in the NCAA 500-yard freestyle. She is the first transgender athlete to be crowned NCAA champion, but not without controversy.
But then he went on to emphasize that Leah is male. He also claimed that the entire thing was madness. And what's even more surprising, according to him, is that Leah hasn't undergone gender confirmation surgery and is involved in sexual relationships with women. He couldn't wrap his head around the idea that you could just say you're a woman, and just like that, everyone treats you as one. He wanted to make it clear that this discussion went beyond trans rights. For him, it raised deeper questions about how we define and understand the very essence of being human. Joe emphasized the importance of maintaining distinction in sports, saying that there's a reason why we have separate divisions for men and women. He said that nowadays, anyone could just decide they're a woman and compete in women's sports without any regulations or clarifications. And if you question that, you're immediately labeled as transphobic. He also added that it's not about being transphobic, it's about ensuring fairness in sports. For him, it's absolutely mind-boggling that this is still happening.
Critics say she has an unfair physical advantage over the other swimmers and should not have been allowed to compete.
Now they discussed the matter some more, and their views were quite honestly a little too off-putting. During their conversation, Joe, Peter Attia, and producer Jamie Vernon discussed the final ruling from the previous year, which basically said that only swimmers who transitioned from male to female before the age of 12 would be allowed to compete in events. They also mentioned a similar ruling passed by World Athletics for track and field competitions. Expressing his strong sentiments, Joe said that the impact this new ruling has had on those other girls who are competing against the transgender athlete is just a terrible crime. He said that it was truly awful. The podcaster gave the example that these girls are doing everything right, watching their diet, focusing on recovery, and giving it their all. Then they have this person who decides they're a woman while having testosterone in their body their entire life. Imagine being a biological woman who's putting in all the hard work, dedicating yourself to being the absolute best, only to then get absolutely dominated. As per Rogan's point of view, it was all maddening. His passionate response clearly showed his concern about fairness and the consequences for cisgender women athletes, even if they came off as super transphobic. He strongly felt that allowing people who had experienced years of testosterone exposure to compete against cisgender women just seemed unjust and created an imbalance in competition. And if that stunned you, wait until you hear his input on the whole gender equality thing. He expressed his perspective on the matter, noting that there are many other pressing issues that society should be addressing instead of getting caught up in what he referred to as another culture war. But he's a bit worried about how we're getting so fixated on these strange issues. According to the podcaster, it's like we believe that if we just let everyone freely express their own truth, all the inequalities and problems in the world will magically disappear. But here's the thing. Joe thinks that this approach might unintentionally encourage mental illness, promote virtue signaling, and lead to a whole bunch of people adopting beliefs that aren't actually backed up by facts. Hey, those are his words, not mine. To be fair, Rogan did say that he's all for personal expression. At the same time, he's urging everyone to think carefully about the potential consequences. For him, we need to strike a balance between respecting individuals' perspectives and making sure we don't endorse harmful or baseless ideas. Joe wants the world to take a thoughtful and evidence-based approach when dealing with the challenges our society faces. It's about finding that middle ground and not just relying on personal opinions without considering the bigger picture. So there you have it, from Joe thinking how the whole gender equality thing is getting out of hand, to having issues with Fallon Fox competing in women's sports. Those were Joe Rogan's controversial views on female UFC fighters.